Hey everyone, it's Austin back again with another video for Human Ideals. This is the second entry to my three-part mini-series on communication and culture. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about the idea of postracialism, which is the theory that society as a whole, modern society, has transcended systemic discrimination and the need to speak out against racism. Now, a corollary to that is the idea of true humanism. Nowadays, we want to, there's this cliche saying of, I don't see race, or I don't see color, or, race and class and gender are just arbitrary constructions. We're all human. These sayings, in this essay, we're going to be asking the question, do these sayings have any basis in reality? Do we have a right to believe such things when there is obviously racial and systemic discrimination? Now, as I've mentioned many times before, those on the political right, figures such as Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, heavily speak out against the identity politics rhetoric of the left, and the left, on the flip side, uses this narrative of counter-hegemony and resistance to speak out against racism, but that often gets into labeling and class distinctions, and that's a very complicated issue that I addressed in my first essay. What is a truly counter-hegemonic culture? Now, an extension of that is what is a truly transracial I guess you could say postracialism type of humanistic ideology. Now, the real-world example I'm using in this essay is Marvel's Cloak and Dagger, which is a TV show that really addresses this issue of racial discrimination, but more importantly, it addresses the underlying theme of emotional conflict and very specific emotional hardships to each of the main characters. We have Tyrone Johnson, he's an African-American black male, and this really plays into his repeated struggles against police brutality, while Tandy Bowen, on the flip side, who later becomes his friend and partner in crime, she has gone through a lot of hardships despite being an upper-class white girl. She faces homelessness and drug abuse in the first half of the season. But anyway, that changes later on. I won't go into that, but there's so many themes in this essay that I think you guys will enjoy with regards to identity politics and really offering a higher humanistic take on class conflict. And we talk about ideas such as sexism and the male gaze, and really challenging those themes. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this essay titled True Humanism in Emotional Transmutation, Marvel's Cloak and Dagger. The challenge of addressing discrimination on the basis of race, class, or gender is to acknowledge the systemic reality of said issues while attempting to transcend them. This is the solution propounded by postracialism, a form of humanistic theory and rhetoric that posits race as a divisive social construction, arguing that the debate around racial discrimination no longer pertains to modern societal behavior. The critique of supposedly post-racial technologies in Ruha Benjamin's If Race is a Technology, Post-Racialism is the Genius Bar refutes the validity of this outlook, stating the example of scientific technologies such as DNA tests and spirometers used to unintentionally marginalize or segregate minority groups. The deconstruction of post-racial dismissiveness thus acts as a more overarching critique of naive humanism. However, unlike naive humanism, true humanism would resolve the imbalance of power in systemic discrimination while preventing further class conflict between the privileged and the discriminated. This is to be accomplished by addressing the emotional causes perpetuating the systemic roots of discrimination. The dilemma, however, lies in the effectiveness of said causes for mitigating said class conflict. Nevertheless, the rise in progressive films and television shows within the Hollywood superhero genre signifies popular demand for non-discriminatory humanism. Marvel's Cloak and Dagger is a superhero show that excels in its depiction of true humanism. It juxtaposes the powers of seeing people's hopes and fears to expose the emotional roots connecting race, class, and gender inequality, advocating the transmutation of these emotions into solutions to be shared by privileged and discriminated groups alike, which then dissolves class conflict without dismissing systemic discrimination. Essentially, Cloak and Dagger challenges racial privilege and scopophilic sexism through this motif of emotional transmutation, framing the protagonist's supernatural powers as emotional technologies that dissolve the socioeconomic conflicts between themselves and those existing among the show's viewers. The desire for humanism that challenges discrimination may be perpetuated by an already established convention of normality. In Richard Dyer's work on the matter of whiteness, the representation of whiteness as an unmarked category is deconstructed on the assumption of white individuals being, quote-unquote, ordinary people, standing in for other racial groups, and on the construal of non-white individuals as being deviant from the norm. Quote, having no content, we can't see that we have anything that accounts for our position of privilege and power. White people have power and believe that they think, feel, and act like and for all people. Most of this is not done deliberately and maliciously, yet white power nonetheless reproduces itself because it is not seen as whiteness, but as normal. In other words, whiteness needs to be made strange. End quote. In constructing the different social backgrounds of Cloak and Dagger's protagonists, the producer ensures that the hegemony of white universalism is challenged. Tyrone Johnson, an upper-class black male teenager, goes against the stereotype of coming from a poor, crime-ridden neighborhood. Meanwhile, Tandy Bowen, a homeless white girl, flips the narrative of high economic status typically associated with whiteness. The producer takes the effort to make whiteness strange through the counter-narratives that both characters embody. This is also done without the denigration of either whiteness or high economic status, thus preventing the possibility of class conflict, enabling white and non-white viewers alike to sympathize with the hardships of both characters. In the transmutation of universality from an otherwise hegemonic concept to a non-dismissive alternative of postracialism, Marvel's Cloak and Dagger solidifies the validity of a humanistic solution to discrimination. The humanistic message of Cloak and Dagger is supported not only through the relatability of Tyrone and Tandy, but also in the conflict that arises during their exchanges. The producer tries to maintain viewers' sympathy towards contrasting perspectives on dealing with privilege. The ensuing fallout between the protagonists acts as a double-sided critique. It clearly disproves the belief in modern society being post-racial, while also showing the harm in disparaging privilege as an effective means towards ending discrimination. Quote, Tandy says, "Where do you live, Tyrone? Good neighbors, good house, you go to a good school. I'm sorry that your two living parents care about you so much. Must be a real drag, Sway." To which Tyrone says, "What? You want to teach me how to lie? Teach me how to be a con man? Let me check your privilege." My privilege? I've had a lot of things taken from me, and everything I have, I've had to steal because you can. Try walking into a department store looking like me. End quote. What makes this critique of post-racialism distinct is the presence of a deeper emotional wound fueling Tandy's dismissiveness, one that is arguably more nuanced than solely attributing her reaction to quote-unquote unmarked white universalism. Tandy calls out the luxury of Tyrone growing up in an affluent family, not to negate racial discrimination by using wealth as a scapegoat. Rather, the producer portrays this as the longing for emotional security and functioning parents, being that Tandy's mother is a struggling drug addict much like herself. Adding to the flashbacks of her growing up in an abusive household, the producer exposes the audience to non-systemic motives explaining the dismissal of others' discrimination. This posits the dismissal of discrimination as being independent of post-racialism and white universalism, even though it is present in both ideologies. This also does not act as an outright denial of Tandy's dismissal, being influenced by postracialism, at least to some degree. More importantly, the producer sets up this dilemma to present the protagonist's emotional powers as truly humanistic technologies, in contrast to the quote-unquote post-racial technologies critiqued by Ruha Benjamin. Having the protagonists first-handedly experience each other's hopes and fears, the show creates a way for both critics of white universalism and post-racialists to empathize with each other's arguments. In doing so, emotional perspective taking is framed as an essential component of anti-discriminatory humanism. Marvel's Cloak and Dagger uses the superpowers of Tandy and Tyrone to symbolize the spirit manifesting within the material body. In the scene leading up to the protagonist's initial fallout, the two find themselves inexplicably waking up in each other's minds. Tandy, with her ability to see people's hopes, tries to tap into that of Tyrone, only to be taken aback by his fantasy of committing suicide by cop. Of course, the producer uses this to explain Tyrone's guilt over causing the death of his older brother, Billy, who was shot by a white police officer, due to him stealing an old car radio. Having Tyrone fantasize about taking his brother's place lends emotional credibility to Tandy, resolving his feelings of discrimination through her powers. Tandy makes an appeal to morality by telling Tyrone not to keep exacting revenge on his brother's killer. He points a gun at the officer and repeatedly gets himself killed through gunshots, mob lynchings, and so forth. She then pulls out her dagger of light, a so-called solution of hope, and forms a pair of handcuffs so that Tyrone can put away the officer through lawful justice. It is worth noting that, from the perspective of critiquing post-racialism, this solution of lawful justice ignores one reason behind Tyrone's hidden frustration. He believes that the police department will never hold the officer accountable. The corruption and apathy of the justice system is a recurring motif of the show. Quote, "Until we come to grips with the reasonableness of racism, we will continue to look for it in the dashboard cameras on Texas highways and overlook it in the smart-sounding logics of textbooks, policy statements, court rulings, etc." End quote. Throughout this scene, the mind-body distinction of Christianity positions whiteness as an unmarked category, which explains how Tandy can take on Tyrone's hopes as her own. She acts only as a conduit for other people's hopes, i.e. other races, without bringing in her own. Quote, "Christianity, and the particular inflection it gives to Western dualist thought, is founded on the idea, paradoxical, unfathomable, profoundly mysterious, of incarnation, of being that is in the body, yet not of it." End quote. The underlying association of whiteness with spirit may partly explain Tandy's post-racial dismissiveness against Tyrone during their fallout. She tries to literally embody Tyrone's racial discrimination inside his mind, making herself special and experiencing the consequences of non-whiteness while still being white. Quote, "All concepts of race are concepts of bodies and have had to be reconciled with notions of embodiment and incarnation. The latter became what distinguished white people, giving them a special relation to race. Black people in white culture can be reduced to their bodies and thus to race." End quote. However, the producer provides a counter-argument against this white universalist take on her actions. Tyrone tries to resolve Tandy's fears of losing her father in the same scene, establishing the two as equals. This implies that true humanism only manifests when unconscious subjects of white universalism and those subject to racial discrimination choose to cooperate with one another. It is not the universality of the embodied spirit in whiteness, per se, that undermines its attempts towards humanism. Rather, it is the lack of mutual embodiment in the power dynamics between socially privileged and discriminated groups that perpetuates this naive humanism, acting as a substitute for valid empathy-based solutions. While such groups in real life may not have the superpowers of Tandy and Tyrone, Both parties must be willing to rise above the mere denigration of privilege and support the discovery of each other's emotional causes for perpetuating discrimination or being discriminated against. The case for hope and fear being truly humanistic technologies is thereby supported, transmuting the quote-unquote embodied spirit into a non-hegemonic solution against systemic discrimination. In establishing a humanistic solution to discrimination, one that does not succumb to the pitfalls of postracialism or white universality, Marvel's Cloak and Dagger also challenges systemic sexism. In addressing its viewers, the show specifically deconstructs sexism based on scopophilia, the act of deriving pleasure in looking at a human subject. Laura Mulvey's work, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, describes the imbalance of power between the active male gaze and the passive female object that arises from the visual editing and representation of film. Since the show uses a male and female protagonist, their dynamic appears as though Tyrone were symbolizing the phallocentric ego ideal of male viewers, with Tandy only being used to reinforce the passive female role. Quote, "The man controls the film fantasy and also emerges as the representative of power in a further sense, as the bearer of the look of the spectator, transferring it behind the screen to neutralize the extra-diegetic tendencies represented by woman as spectacle." End quote. This further divides scopophilia into its two main expressions, one being voyeurism, the act of deriving sexual pleasure from looking at the other, and narcissism, the derivation of pleasure from looking at oneself. The producer, however, challenges this initial impression in a rather unexpected manner. Tandy is made to take ownership of scopophilia rather than being subjugated to its typically passive female role. In another scene where Tandy uses her powers, she tries to seduce corporate executives at an expensive gala so she can tap into their hopes. Here, Tandy's to-be-looked-atness, as described by Mulvey, does not reduce her importance down to her sexuality. Instead, she takes advantage of the male executive's scopophilia in tracking down the villain of this season, Peter Scarborough, hidden within their shared hopes. Again, Tandy's powers act as an emotional technology that dissolves the imbalance of power between male and female roles. Yet the typical critique of scopophilic sexism would posit the ego ideal of the male protagonist, the projected self-image of whom male viewers would like to become, as disempowering the female protagonist, thereby denouncing it as an inherently negative emotional construct. Phallocentrism would frame the woman as a threat to the male ego ideal in not having a penis, also known as castration threat. Quote, "Her lack of a penis implying a threat of castration and hence on pleasure. Thus the woman as icon displayed for the gaze and enjoyment of men, the active controllers of the look, always threatens to invoke the anxiety it originally signified." End quote. In creating a healthy ego ideal for both Tyrone and Tandy through their powers, this anxiety of castration threat is nullified. Doing so allows for the positive emotional role of the ego ideal to be acknowledged, regardless of which gender it applies to. This mirrors the transmutation of the embodied spirit mentioned earlier. It is the ability of these emotional powers to elevate the objectified female sex, without denigrating the ego ideal typically associated with the empowered male sex, that supports their effectiveness as truly humanistic technologies against sexism. It is the resulting cessation of conflict between male and female roles, be it between viewers and on-screen characters, or the conflict between on-screen characters themselves, that imbues these emotional powers with humanism. Marvel's Cloak and Dagger is a superhero show that convincingly validates the possibility of true humanism. The portrayal of Tyrone and Tandy as characters emotionally wounded by their social backgrounds posits their powers as necessities for dissolving their conflict. The postracial belief in society having transcended racism is disproved in the fallout between the two characters. The apparent universality of whiteness is challenged in Tandy's dismissal of Tyrone's discrimination, using her own struggles. This is also present in Tandy being able to embody Tyrone's hopes, partly due to the unmarked nature of whiteness. However, the producer uses these deconstructions to set up the argument for true humanism. The motif of emotional transmutation elevates the universality in white universalism. The atypical backgrounds of these characters become relatable to both white and non-white viewers. Similarly, the humanistic direction of postracialism is refined by positing the solutions to systemic racism as emotional embodiment of the other's discrimination between privileged and discriminated groups. The ego ideal is transmuted into a positive representation for male and female viewers, which repurposes and takes ownership of scopophilic sexism. Through emotional transmutation, Cloak and Dagger successfully addresses and transcends the power imbalance in systemic discrimination. The producer emphasizes that this is only possible through the non-dismissive cooperation between privileged and vulnerable groups, positing basic human emotions as stepping stones for solving all structural manifestations of discrimination, be it in race, class, or gender conflict.
First, we look at the past. New Orleans is a roller coaster of destruction and rebirth. Fire, famine, disease, war. It always came down to two people. The divine pairing.
Voodoo, my blood is living. Blood, taste, chillin'. Jimmy got soul of a mimic.
I feel like I have to be perfect. Like I have to do everything right.
I go the other way. I run away from everything. I've had a lot of things taken from me. And everything I have, I've had to steal.
There's something about fear that pushes me. That's my whole life.
Whenever anything goes wrong, I hightail it out of town.
I think we need to talk.
When we touch, shit goes boom. Let's test our limits.
It's the same as it was for all the others. One will live, and one will die.
The universe keeps pushing us together.
The universe keeps pulling us apart.